Welcome, I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel. Today we'll talk about the astrology forecast for July 2020, which is available early for my patrons and then to the general public the 1st of July. I have titled this month's episode a reprise, and I'll explain what that means in a second. First, I wanted to say a big thank you to my patrons who make these videos possible. If you are not yet a patron and would like to be, you can go to patreon.com/Nina Griffin, and you'll get access to videos early, as well as in the higher tiers, access to exclusive videos that are never made available to the public, where I discuss current astrology in a lot more detail. All right, let's get started. So a reprise means a repetition or a revival of a past event or trend. And if we just take a look backwards for a second, June 24th brought us the end of the 6-week Venus retrograde. Now, you may want to rewatch the May 2020 forecast, where I spent a lot more time speaking about Venus. And I compare her journey, her retrograde journey, to a carnival. And a carnival isn't just a place of entertainment, but it has a very specific historic meaning. A carnival historically was a place and a time when social norms were reversed for a limited period. So masters acted as slaves and slaves could act like masters. Everything was stood up on its head and different. So, however, it was always known to be a temporary period where everything was allowed, but again, it was limited by time. What we saw with Venus retrograde, as I had mentioned, we were going to see essentially a compulsion to socialize. When planets go retrograde, their qualities often have a compulsive or almost violent element to them. And that is what we got. We got a lot of demonstrations. We got a lot of people protesting for their right to be free of any kind of pandemic-related restrictions. So many different ways to act out one's desire to be with other people, which is really the fundamental nature of Venus. But now Venus is direct, and we are back to, not exactly normal, but we are back to a certain level of normalcy, and that level of intense compulsion and need has seemed to have receded, at least for the time being. Now, again, the theme of reprise or return will be a major concept for us in July, because we will be revisiting some of the same themes and problems that we had encountered in the first quarter of 2020. The way I think of July is it presents an opportunity for us to relearn or be tested on some of the same issues from the early part of the year. Now, of course, a lot of it that's going to be about the COVID response. In a lot of countries, including the United States, the big question is going to be, now that we have rising cases in a lot of different states, what have we learned from the first time around to avoid some of those terrible results that we saw in places like New York or Italy or other locations that were initially so overwhelmed by virus victims? The question on a personal level in July then will be, what are we going to do? What would you have done differently? On a personal level, would you have done something differently in the first quarter of the year? You might have an opportunity, for better or for worse, to redo that again. Right? So you are faced with the same lesson, you are faced with that test. What do you do? All right, let's take this week by week. So in week 1 of July, probably the biggest thing happens right on July 1st, and that's Saturn retrograding back into Capricorn. He's been in Aquarius since March 21st, and he'll be in Capricorn until December 16th, so pretty much the rest of the year. So for the next 5.5 months, we essentially encounter those same problems that we saw in the first part of the year, both individually and at a societal larger level. Generally, the rule is the quicker the learner, the less painful the lesson is going to be the second time around. If you handled things pretty well in the first part of the year, you're probably going to handle them just as well in July. So that's the good news. If you didn't handle things so well, you have a chance to do it better. You get a do-over this time. Now, July 4th, there's going to be a lunar penumbral eclipse. I think of it as a more intense full moon, and it'll be at 13 degrees of Cancer. Now, a penumbral eclipse is where we have essentially an imperfect alignment of the shadow across the moon. So it's never a complete eclipse anywhere. It's more of a darker shading across the face of the moon. So yes, it's a little bit more than what I would consider a full moon, but it's pretty faint. So I'm hesitant to give it as much power as a regular good old lunar eclipse. Now, because it's happening July 4th, you know it's going to activate the United States chart natal sun in Cancer, and with all of our other Cancer placements that we have here in the US chart. In addition, it also activates China. China has historically been associated with the sign of Cancer, and what's fascinating is that even the modern charts for China and the Chinese Communist Party all have very powerful Cancer placements. In fact, what I didn't know until recently is that the Chinese Communist Party was actually founded during a multi-day meeting that took place on a boat on a lake, which I don't know if it could be more Cancerian than that, but you can see how when you have a nation that's subject to a certain sign, regardless of the time in history, that symbolism of that sign will keep coming up again and again, quite accidentally and in unplanned ways. Now, this lunation on July 4th also underscores the idea of repeated lessons from the past. And that's because the eclipses that started in December, or especially that happened in December, really empowered and exploded the COVID disease to the level of the epidemic that we see today. Now, the other thing that's special about this eclipse is that it's the last one on the Cancer-Capricorn axis. So I think of it as the last hurrah of an era. The last 18 months or so are coming to an end, and for better or for worse, we are going to be entering a new set of themes with the new eclipses coming up. Now, July 8th is an interesting aspect. We have Mars in Aries squaring Mercury, who will be retrograde in Cancer. This will be at 6 Aries and 6 degrees of Cancer. Now, this aspect is interesting because it actually repeats later in the month when Mercury turns direct and essentially remakes the square. I think of this time as a seemingly light or possibly subtle preview of the kinds of issues that will come up later during our Mars square Saturn period. I have recorded several videos on the theme of Mars square Saturn, since we'll be dealing with that for 6 to 8 months, depending on how you're measuring it. So if you would like to watch those videos, definitely head over to patreon.com/NinaGriffin, and they're all there. I go from kind of a very macro view of this aspect to a much more narrow micro view, including how it might impact you personally. So July 8th, we are going to get some of those same signs activated. Certainly Mars will be in Aries still, and Mercury will be in Cancer, who is opposite the placement of Saturn in Capricorn, where we're going to get some of that activity going on later this year. So the way that this could manifest is obviously some kind of conflict. It could be a conflict related to business. It could be related to media or communication. I think those are the two most likely areas of conflict and of difficulty. I wouldn't be surprised if in a lot of places that are seeing a lot of COVID cases, there's going to be a big conflict about, do we close? What do we do? How do you run a society during a pandemic? I mean, it's a real problem with no obvious or easy answers. Now, July 12th, Mercury will turn direct at 5 degrees of Cancer. So this is almost the same degree where it squared Mars. And I think of this week as the week of the plot twist. So it's kind of the revelation that leads to a surprise outcome, right? July 8th is sort of the confrontation, and then July 12th is the surprise reveal of some sort. Maybe somebody changes their position, something really shifts here and gives this tension and gives this problem a whole different face. Now, in general, I will say that Mercury is going to be stronger when he's in Cancer than when he's direct in Cancer. However, at the same time, I think that Mars in Aries with this repeated square will be better positioned to win. So if there is somebody who is sort of bringing the war to a Mercury person, right? Somebody who's bringing the war to business or bringing the war to the media. The person bringing the war will win, partly because Mars is going to be in the overcoming or superior part of the square, but also because Mars has a lot more essential dignity being in his own sign. I'll talk a little bit more about this later. Now, the third week of July will be interesting too. So July 14th is when the Sun will oppose Jupiter retrograde at 22 Cancer and 22 Capricorn. The reason this is important is that after this opposition, Jupiter becomes an occidental planet, meaning he will rise after the Sun. Now, as a superior planet, Mars, Jupiter, or Saturn, those are the superior planets, they don't like being occidental. Mars, depending on which school of thought you follow, he sometimes might prefer it, but certainly Jupiter and Saturn prefer to rise before the Sun. So I think of the opposition from the Sun to the superior planets as a transformative point that's really second only to the conjunction with the Sun when these planets have that solar conjunction. When superior planets go from being oriental to being occidental, they lose their preeminence and they kind of have to play second fiddle to the Sun because they now rise after it. So I could see at this time having confrontations with authority and very sort of pointed and very public conflicts because, you know, Jupiter doesn't like being told he's number two, even though the Sun is the king. Jupiter represents people in society who are wealthy, people who might have some kind of advantage of birth based on, you know, being born kind of at higher levels of society. He also represents the judicial system. So we can see here a confrontation between authority and any of these parts of society, essentially. So because Jupiter is going to be retrograde and goes occidental, it does feel like the authority, at least for now, wins, right? This conflict. What I've noticed as well is that the third and fourth week of July, we have essentially a very quick sequence of Sun opposing Jupiter and then Sun opposing Saturn. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means when we take those together rather than just individually. So July 20th, the following week, the Sun opposes Saturn at 28 Cancer and Capricorn. So again, Saturn becomes an occidental planet, rising after the Sun, just like Jupiter. So here, the confrontation is between the authorities and the common people. And not just the common people, but Saturn represents the poorest people in society. He can represent farmers, rich or poor, but very often Saturn represents people who have the least desirable and lowest paid jobs. Now, my concern generally is that because Jupiter and Saturn tend to be the economic planets, is that worldwide, and certainly in the United States, the second half of July is when we will see some really negative economic impacts from COVID that are going to affect a lot of people. I don't exactly know what that's going to look like, but I do know, for example, in the US, that around this time is when that federal supplement that a lot of people have been getting for their unemployment benefits runs out. And at least at the time of this video, Congress has not yet reauthorized any kind of additional funds later. So there are a lot of people out there out of work, but there is no money, there's no really additional money coming to them after July. They might get their usual state unemployment amounts, but often those are quite low. So we could see quite a dramatic fall in the ability of kind of the average unemployed person to spend or maybe even buy basic needs like food and shelter. Now, week 5, which is kind of a partial week, is going to be quite eventful for, the very tail end of the month. So July 27th is we have Jupiter sextile Neptune at 20 Capricorn and Pisces. Jupiter will be retrograde, and this is in fact the second aspect of Jupiter sextile Neptune. This is very often a very powerful and optimistic aspect for the stock market. And it's kind of funny, the last time this aspect happened was February 20th, which was exactly at the time when the US stock market peaked this year. It hasn't regained its levels to that point just yet, at least if you're looking at the S&P 500, which is a fairly broad measure of the stock market. And so it's interesting, even though this aspect hasn't been exact since then, the planets have been in orb. And everyone has been talking about how much the stock market seems to have been divorced from reality. The reality being, COVID, widespread unemployment, all of those things. And yet the stock market was in, sort of undisturbed for at least the last month or two. So I wonder if we're going to get a bit of a repeat where the stock market seems totally happy, even if average people might be actually struggling economically quite a bit. Now, that same day, Mercury in Cancer will square Mars in Aries again. And so this happens at 16 Cancer Capricorn. The difference is that Mercury is now direct, whereas the first time around in early July, he was retrograde. So I think of this time, this last part of July, as the final resolution to the naughty problem that happened in the first and second week of July. So whatever we were dealing with at that time seems a little more straightforward now, right? It's not necessarily easier to resolve, but at least we kind of know who's who the bad guys and who the good guys are. That plot twist that we had earlier, that sort of has run its course. And now we are sort of seeing things a little bit more directly as they really are. Now, as with all squares, there's always a winner and a loser. And as I explained earlier, Mars is definitely the winner here compared to Mercury. Mars has a lot more essential dignity, being in his own sign, and he is also on the superior side of this square. So Mercury has a little essential dignity too. He's actually in his bound and his decan, or face. So he has two lesser dignities, and that's certainly better than nothing. So we're not dealing with a completely Godzilla versus Bambi type situation, but certainly Mars is likely to win over here. So whoever is playing the role of the aggressor, whoever is playing the role of the conqueror, is likely to come off better at this time. Now, July 30th, which is just 3 days later, Mercury gets into yet another tangle, this time in opposition with Jupiter at 20 Cancer and 20 Capricorn. So, however, an opposition to Jupiter doesn't always have to be negative. It helps that he's a benefic. So there is still the sense that Mercury tries to get some kind of maybe restitution or some kind of recompense. It almost feels, from a legal perspective, it kind of feels like an appeal. Things didn't go so well for Mercury when he squared Mars, so he goes to yet another or maybe higher authority represented by Jupiter. And it's not an easy relationship, but I like this better for Mercury because Mercury here is received by Jupiter. Mercury in Cancer is in Jupiter's exaltation. So Jupiter gives Mercury a little bit of consideration. Now, it's still an opposition that we're dealing with. So we're going to see a little bit of, what would I call it? I would call it kind of a grudging respect and a grudging helping hand here. So whatever Mercury represents, whether it's business or whether it's the law or some kind of major legal case, gets another shot at life, for better or worse. There is some kind of lifeline being extended to Mercury that is going to help it live to fight another day. All right, so much for July. Thank you very much for watching. I'm Nina Griffin, and this is the Astrology and Magic channel. Take care.